to you. The only thing I'd like to say about Ben's presentation, since he's going to say all the important stuff, is this is a really good example of a person who's taken a topic important to him and decided to learn more about it and learn enough about it to teach you about it. And I think as a kickoff presentation, this is a perfect one because it encompasses all of the things we ask our capstone students to do. Take something they care deeply about, that they already know something about, learn more about it, and share it with us. Ben?
All right, let's get the ball rolling. All right, today we're going to start with autism and Asperger's syndrome. That's my topic. So let's look at the word autism. Now, by a show of hands, has anyone ever seen this word before in their life? Anyone? Can anyone give me a definition? Grant?
It's brain deformation that causes certain unusual behaviors and some incorrect thinking in the brain.
All right, that's a valid definition. So before I begin starting my definition, I'll tell you why I chose autism as a topic. Now, I myself am diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. I was diagnosed at 18 months old, and I had to take speech classes until 5th grade. And I had the same symptoms as I will mention later on in the presentation. And I also am interested in the sciences too, because I'm going to be majoring in science at college. So I figured, why not take something that combines both science and what I have into something big like this? And I just wanted to learn more about it because I've been wondering about it all my life. Like, what causes autism? How does it appear in children? Everything like that. So I figured, why not do a presentation on this topic? So the first question I started out with before I began my research is, what is autism? And this is what I came up with. Now, autism is what is known as a pervasive developmental disorder, which means more than one basic function is either delayed or damaged. Remember that. That's an important idea in autism. So you have autism here, but you have Asperger's syndrome as a different sort of thing. I'll get into that in a minute. But basically, they're both the same thing, but they're different nuances of each other. Then you have childhood disintegrative syndrome and Rett syndrome, which are also PEDs, but they're more serious stuff. I didn't really delve into this, but basically, you have more mental retardation. Dietary problems are especially prominent in childhood disintegrative syndrome. Rett syndrome is more mental retardation based than anything else, but basically, these are more serious conditions. And then you have something that's really weird. It's called PDD-NOS, which stands for pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. Basically, it's a disorder in which none of the above things have any relation to. So you could have the social aspects that you can see in autism and Asperger's syndrome, in which the child doesn't say anything until the age of 2, but then there could be less dietary problems involved, and that doesn't fit into any of these categories at all. And maybe the social problems probably go away later on in life. So PDD-NOS is that designation. So here are the characteristics of autism. Now, I based this off what is known as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 4th revision, which basically describes every single mental disorder known to man. Everything from anxiety to mood disorders. It's in there. Look it up. So anyway, we have the characteristics of autism here. We have impairment in nonverbal behaviors, which basically you have no eye contact. The eye contact is definitely gone. You have facial expression. People could probably laugh at something that's a very serious situation. Or they could cry at something that's not really a sad situation at all. And then you have body postures, awkward body postures. They probably would walk like this, or they don't walk straight. And then you have inappropriate gestures. They might make gestures like this all the time in talking, and it's probably not necessary once they're discussing something like this, all that stuff. But basically, that's part of that. And then you have failure to develop peer relationships, which basically ties into the social aspect of autism. Basically, they can't make relationships or they can't make friends as easy as other people can, which hence this friendships or relationships appropriate to developmental level. They just can't make friends as easily as other people would. And then you have the lack of feeling to share with others. Basically, they don't like sharing interests, they don't like sharing activities or enjoyment with other people, mostly because they can't relate to them or because they just have a hard time understanding what other people think or act, so they normally don't share things with other people. And they don't like pointing things out either, or objects of interest at all, hence the lack of feeling to share with others. And finally, this is a major one, lack of social or emotional reciprocity, which means they can't relate to other people. You'll see that come up again later on in the presentation. But basically, they're unable to relate to others. They can't think reciprocally in that sense. They can't relate to other people, hence their social aspects are a bit impaired or delayed. Now that I've given you a definition about autism and the scientific aspect, let's look at the history aspect, the history of autism. Because the definition of autism influenced his history, and history influenced his definition. So, given that, let's look at the history of autism. Now, there's no written record for autism until the advent of psychology under Sigmund Freud, but nothing was really written until 1911. You have this guy named Eugen Bleuler, who was a Swiss psychiatrist, and he was the one who coined the term schizophrenia. The modern definition for schizophrenia was derived by him. He coined the new Latin phrase autismus in 1910 to describe symptoms of autism, and he called them autistic symptoms because with schizophrenia you have symptoms like they're isolated and they only focus on themselves. The new Latin word autismus actually derives from the Greek autos, which means self. So basically, he coined the symptoms of schizophrenia as autistic, and that was the first time that term was ever used in modern language. Now this is another banner year for autism, 1943. Remember that, please. 1943 is a major year for autism. You have the two big guns of autism, as I like to call them, Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger. Now, Leo Kanner is the guy on the left. He's Austrian. He emigrated to America. He worked at Johns Hopkins. He was majoring in pediatrics. Basically, he was the one who actually came up with the formal definition for autism because he wrote this paper in 1943, Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact, and what it basically stated is all the things that I mentioned earlier, the lack of social or emotional reciprocity, language abilities are delayed, everything. Everything that I mentioned in the past couple slides, he wrote that down in his paper. And it was very important because that definition has actually been utilized for further research. And then you have Hans Asperger. Now, he did kind of the same thing. He didn't know Leo Kanner existed, so he also derived autism, and he worked at the University of Vienna because he was also Austrian, but basically, what he did was he not only wrote down what autism is and how it causes it, but he also wrote down what Asperger's syndrome is. And it wasn't really called Asperger's syndrome until the 90s, but basically he came up with the definition for Asperger's syndrome as well. Now the difference between the two is as follows. Autism is everything that I mentioned earlier, but with Asperger's syndrome, the social and language abilities actually come back through I would say, through speech therapy and through social interaction. But basically, they can also have something known as islets of abilities, as mentioned by Connor. They can have an extreme knowledge of one certain subject. Like, for instance, he mentions about a kid who knew so much physical science that it surpassed his knowledge of physical science. So basically, he called them little professors because he knew so much about it. The kids knew so much about a certain subject, and that's what differentiates between the two. Asperger's syndrome might have an implication for somebody who knows a lot of things, has a very big ability in one certain subject. With autism, that ability, the extraordinary ability, may not be present. So then we move on to the 1960s, which more theories were put into place in the 1960s, and I'll show you that in a minute. But basically, you have this guy named Bernard Rimland, who is an American psychologist and psychiatrist, and he was a former head of the Autism Director of Research. Basically, his son was diagnosed with autism in 1956, and back then, autism diagnosis was rare. Not many people were diagnosed with autism at that point because the definition was made 10 years before, but his son was diagnosed with autism, and he went on a quest to figure out what autism is and how it appears in children and how it affects children. So he came up with this whole book, Infantile Autism, and what he states in the book is basically autism is biologically and genetically based. Autism appears in genetics, and thus autism appears in children. That's what he says. Basically, he came up with the biological theory of autism alongside other people, but he was the first proponent of it. And then you have his polar opposite, Bruno Bettelheim, who was Austrian, and he came to America in the 40s, I believe. Basically, he researched people who were autistic and went into his hospital, and he came up with this whole book called The Empty Fortress. And basically, here's what he says. He says that autism could be genetic, but there's also a major possibility that autism could be caused by the parents. Not kidding. He states that the mothers are responsible for autism because they ignore the children, and that they just disregard the children and they just be negligent. So the mothers did not pay attention to the children, therefore the autism appears in children. And that's known as the refrigerator mother theory, which basically is another word for the mother's cold. Oh, the child has autism because the mother didn't pay attention to him. Okay, fine, whatever. Oh yeah, fun fact, he committed suicide at the age of 83 and he plagiarized a lot. That's okay, so that's how important he is. So anyway, we move on to the 1970s and 1990s, and in fact, Bettelheim is also a major proponent of another theory, which I will get to the next slide, the environmental theory of autism. Now here's what it states. you have heavy metals and vaccines. Now the heavy metals thing was a little earlier, like in the 60s. The heavy metals were blamed to cause autism. Mostly lead and mercury were the main causes. Arsenic was also classified as a heavy metal. But more recently in the 90s, vaccines were blamed for autism because vaccines that had like mercury derivatives, like thalidomide and thimerosal that were in there, and the parents even suggested, it was all blamed by the parents. The parents say that autism is caused by these vaccines. And the reason that more parents are saying this is because more people are diagnosed. Ever since the 90s, lots more autistic people were diagnosed. So the parents are like, let's blame the vaccines, let's not blame genetics. The vaccines are the ones who cause everything. So let's review what we learned so far. You have the three main theories of autism. You have the genetic theory, which I mentioned earlier. You have the environmental theory, and what Bruno Bettelheim proposed and he supported was the psychogenic theory. Now, here are my takes on each of these theories. With the genetic theory, I say there's an abundance of evidence, but it's not definitive. You don't know what chromosome is affected. You don't know what gene code is affected. You don't know anything about where it's affected and everything like that. So it's not definitive, and you're not really sure if autism is really genetic at all. But I think there's a bunch of evidence to say that it might be the case. You then have the environmental theory. There could be some evidence, definitely, if you ingest heavy metals, you definitely will damage your body irrevocably. But I say it's mostly speculation. Why do I say this? Well, because, I mean, with some metals, if you ingest a whole lot of metals, definitely you'll get damaged. But I don't think, I think that you have to ingest like at least like 3 buckets of metals to get autism. You know what I mean? Because that doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, unless the parents were actually refrigerator mothers who just let the children alone to eat heavy metals, maybe that's the case. And then finally, you have the psychogenic theory, which is easily disregarded because it just doesn't make any sense. The mothers don't cause the autism. It has to be something else. So why do I think the genetic theory is correct? Why do I believe the genetic theory is the best theory to prove? Well, 3 main reasons. You have the features of the syndrome, the associated factors, and links to other conditions. Now, the features of the syndrome are, it mostly occurs more in males than in females, which could suggest that the Y chromosome could be affected, or it could suggest that a certain chromosome only on the male could be affected. It could be a genetic thing. Then you have associated factors, which means that with most autistics, they can develop like brain damage or mental retardation or epilepsy. Most autistics can develop epilepsy in their adolescence or in their adult years, but basically you have those, and that mostly appears in autistic patients. And then you have links with other conditions, which just basically states that autism can be linked to certain conditions like chromosomal deficiencies, genetic disorders like Fragile X syndrome, which causes mental retardation, and many different symptoms that can be autistic in nature. And then you can also have congenital anomaly syndromes like minor birth defects that occur in children, and those links mostly occur in autistic patients. Again, it could be a genetic thing. Now, this is just a repetition, but let me just repeat to you now. Autism is a PDD. More than one thing is affected. Communication and socialization, both are affected. So it could be neurological in origin, but it can affect psychological things, and it can be a social thing as a result. And basically, with socially, like I said earlier, lack of eye contact, unresponsiveness, lack of attention to people, lack of behavior appropriate to cultural norms, all that stuff. All these are interrelated with PDDs. They're all related to each other. Now, this is something very interesting. I found this in my research, but the theory of mind is a theory that tries to describe how autism appears in children, and it also describes how autism affects children socially. And it basically was a philosophical theory that occurred around the 1600s, but this was actually revised later on just to prove how autism can affect children. So here's what the theory of mind suggests. You're able to understand what other people think, how other people desire, and other intentions of other people, and you can predict what other people do next, which allows for a normal social interaction. Everyone in this room has used the theory of mind while you were talking in the hallways, or eating at lunch, or driving somewhere, or gossiping about something. You used the theory of mind because you perform normal social interaction. You predicted what the other person could do next when you say something, so he says something else, and then you volley back, and that's normal social interaction. That's the theory of mind, basically. So how does this apply to autism? Well, you have this guy named Simon Baron-Cohen, who is a professor at the University of Cambridge, and basically he came up with this theory known as degrees of mind blindness. And here's how it works. With normal people, we can read the minds of others. We can understand how other people think and act. So let's say someone opens the door right now. You can either say, oh, well, this person's going to the bathroom. Oh, well, this person's getting a drink. Oh, well, this person's just leaving. All these what-ifs form the theory of mind because you're able to understand the other person's actions and make logical predictions about it. With autistics, it's harder for them to do that. In fact, it's pretty hard for them to figure out how the actions relate to what they're doing. And thus, they're mind blind. They can't read the minds of others in that sense. So hence, it just describes how autistics can be socially inept in that sense because they're not able to relate to other people since they can't read the minds of other people. Hence that. So I'm going to put you all through a little experiment to show how mind blindness can affect autistic children. This is one of many experiments that Simon Baron-Cohen actually devised to show how autistics can respond to it and prove that they might have a social condition. So anyway, let's give you a little scenario here. You have two main characters, Sally and Ann. They're best friends. They like playing with each other. Now, Sally has this huge beach ball that she likes to play with all the time, and there's a box and a basket. So Sally gets bored and decides to go outside, so she puts the ball in the basket. So she leaves. And then Anne comes, and she's very mischievous. She likes stealing things from other people. She's a kleptomaniac, let's assume that. And she moves the ball into the box, and then she leaves. So Sally comes back. She wants to play with her beach ball again. The trouble is, she doesn't remember where she put the ball in the basket or the box. Then she's like, oh, I know what to do, but you have to tell me. Can anyone tell me where Sally will look for her ball first, in the box or the basket? Linda.
The basket.
Why do you say that?
Because she originally put her ball in the basket.
Exactly. Neurotypical people would say the basket. That's the right answer because she put it in the basket first, and she will look there first because she thought she put it in the basket. Now here's what autistic people say. The box. Why do they say the box? Well, they can't put themselves in Sally's shoes. They don't understand that Sally is a different being in the experiment. The autistic would think, where will Sally look for the box? They will say, where will you look for the ball? Because they saw it happen. They saw the ball moved from the basket to the box. But they didn't factor in that Sally will put it in there originally, so the question just became, where will you look for the ball? And they would say the box. But it's not the box, it's the basket. So hence, mind blindness affects autistic people. Now, I'm going to show you a bit of a video clip from a very famous movie called Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. It's a very famous movie, and people in AP English have seen this already, but basically, I'm going to show you a little bit of it, and I'll tell you why after we see the clip.
Stand it.
I cannot stand it.
You can stand it. You married me for it.
That's a desperately sick lie.
Don't you know it even yet?
Martha.
I'm tired of whipping you. Year after year.
Didn't you, Martha?
It's not what I wanted.
Well, at least you were onto yourself. I didn't know.
I'm
I didn't
onto
know.
myself.
No, you're sick.
Show you who's sick. I'll show you who's sick. I'll show you. I'll show you. I'll show you.
Stop it!
Okay. What did you guys think of that scene? Anybody? What did you guys think?
Violent.
Violent? What else? Yes. What else? Okay. All right. That's a very valid observation. Most people would say, if normal people would look at the scene, they would say, oh, it's very dramatic, the characters are fighting, all that stuff. Autistics would say, oh, there's a very bright arrow in the background, and oh, there's another light over there behind the person's head. The autistic wouldn't focus on the social interactions of the two people, but rather they would focus on the things outside them. They treat people as inanimate objects in that sense. So they would only focus on the things surrounding the characters as opposed to the characters themselves. They never look at the mouth, they look at the things around it. So if we were in Martha and George's house, those are the main characters, they would say, oh, they're very organized, they have all this stuff in the background. Nobody would really pay attention to that, but they would. The minor details is what autistic people would focus on. So based on what I said, the whole presentation, all these symptoms, all these illnesses, you're probably thinking, well, wait, can it be cured? Yes. It can't be cured completely, but there can be treatments that can be done for autistic children. Early intervention is the main thing to understand when you're talking about treatment, because the earlier that you treat your child, the more of a chance that some of their autistic symptoms will either go away or will be diminished completely. That way they can function socially, function in an environment. So enrollment in speech classes, which is what I had speech classes up until 5th grade, as I mentioned earlier. Social therapy is another major one. Social therapy basically forces the children to go into social situations, and thus they can perform socially as normally as other people. Because with autistics, you have to tell them that socially they have to learn. You have to teach them how to be social. Hence, the speech classes and the social therapy. The desired effects are it can increase rate of learning and can diminish problem behaviors like these. These are very distracting behaviors. This is very distracting. They'll stop doing that if you go into speech classes and stuff like that. And there are actually other treatments that I found out about autistic treatment, and Stanley Greenspan, who devised this model, he recently died, but he devised the DIR model, which stands for Developmental, Individual, and Relationships. Basically what that is, if you track the child's developmental stages, like, is the child developing normally? Is their speech impaired? Is their walking impaired? And if you check the individual relationships, as in, oh, how does he take in information? Does he take in information by reading a book, or does he take in information by watching TV? Or you can have relationships, as in, does the child relate to the mother bad, or does he relate to the mother in a good way? And if so, why? And if not, why? Basically, with these three, you have a treatment option that can treat any sort of deficiency in any of these three areas. So it's a custom-made treatment for autistic children, basically. So if they're more socially inhibited, then the relationship aspect is what we focus on. But if they're developmentally delayed, like their speech is impaired, the developmental aspect is what we focus on. It's sort of keen in that sense. And then you have the floor-time approach, which is developed by Greenspan, but also by others. Basically, you let the child wander around in a room filled with toys and stuff like that, and let the child explore the world for what it really is. Someone has to be watching, of course, but the child can explore the world for what it really is. It can address the mind blindness because they can see the object, they can be explained about what the object is and what the person is doing with the object, so they can understand how these objects function, and then they can explore the world on their own. And they can figure out the world is not really as a scary place as they think it to be. And it's very important. Other options can include ABA and OT. Applied behavior analysis basically addresses the behavioral problems that they might have, like they can be easily angry, they can be easily sad, they can cause self-injurious behaviors, like they can hurt themselves because they get very angry. But it addresses that, basically. And with occupational therapy, it just allows for the autistic to develop an independent lifestyle. Because with OT, you have the therapy basically states that the child can get an occupation and do well in life. So that's probably a desired effect, a development of confidence and an opportunity to lead an independent life. Those are the main things to focus on, because if autistics want to lead an independent life, occupational therapy would be the way to go in that sense. Now this is a really, really fascinating topic that I found throughout my research. Savant syndrome. What is savant syndrome, you may ask? Has anyone ever heard of it before? Yes? No? Okay, great. Now, let's move on. I'm glad you heard of it, so now I can discuss it. So, anyway, with savant syndrome, you have islets of ability, as mentioned by Connor, and little professors, as mentioned by Asperger. Basically, you have an unbelievable talent in a certain area or subject, and that occurs mostly in autistic people. So you have art, they're pretty good at drawing or painting. Music, mostly piano playing, mostly with most savants, they're good at playing the piano. Mathematics, they can do very fast mathematical calculations and calendar calculations. If you give them a month, a day, or a year, they can just say what day of the week it falls on. That's simple. They can do it in like 2 seconds. That's how unbelievable they are. And here's an example of a savant that's really good at art. This is Stephen Wiltshire. He's English. He was diagnosed with having Asperger's syndrome. And basically, here's what you can do. If you were to tell him today to go into a helicopter and fly over New York City and say, make a whole panoramic of New York City within, 3 days, he would do it to the minute detail. There would be no errors, if not any small errors at all in his drawing, because he would memorize every street corner, every building, every window. He could memorize the exact number of windows in a building, and that would be correct. Everything. I think this is him drawing London or something, but basically, he could just draw everything like that. That's like an amazing ability. But socially, he's not really the best in terms of social behavior, but that's an example of it. Oh, sorry. All right, and now I leave you, the audience, with a choice. You can, by a show of hands, who wants to see a calendar calculation? Oh, well, excuse me. And by a show of hands, who wants the mathematics one? All right. Be that way. All right, let's go to the mathematics one. So, watch it.
On November 8th, 1931, It's a prime number, 1931. And you were born on a Sunday. And this year your birthday will be on a Wednesday. And you'll be 75.
Precisely.
It's estimated there are only 50 true savants living in the world today, and yet none are like Daniel. He is articulate, self-sufficient, blessed with all of the spectacular ability of a savant, but with very little of the disability. Take his math skills.
Okay, so 31 by 31 by 31 by 31.
Yeah. Is 923,521.
Exactly. All right. Now we'll move on. So savant syndrome is kind of weird because he's a rare breed because he is autistic. He has Asperger's syndrome, but he doesn't have many of the characteristics. He's very social, but he has some of the mannerisms of it, like he has routines every day and all that stuff. But basically, with savant syndrome's qualities, it occurs more often in males than in females. Again, maybe it's a genetic thing, but there could be some reasons why females could have it. For instance, they could mask the syndrome, or they could be misdiagnosed, or they could have a different set of symptoms. That could be a PDD-NOS sort of situation. So anyway, let's look at some historical figures that might have had some Asperger's syndrome. Now, the main thing to understand is with Asperger's syndrome, there could be people who might have social problems, doesn't speak until the age of 3, have routines and rituals they follow every day, can get easily angered. Those are the main characteristics of autism. But basically, I'm going to show you 4 people as proposed by Michael Fitzgerald at Trinity College in Dublin. And he proposes that 4 people might have the syndrome that is analogous to having autism or Asperger's syndrome. It's not entirely proven, and it's basically all speculation, but it's pretty interesting that he focuses on those 4 people. So let's play Guess This Guy, or person. Who do you think this guy is? If you know your philosophers, you definitely should get it right away. No?
I think you're going to have to tell us who they are because we're
all right. This is Ludwig Wittgenstein. He was the most important philosopher of the 20th century. He wrote Tractatus Philosophicus. Basically, with him he wasn't very sociable, and with him, he was very angry all the time. He lived frugally, even though he was rich. So that's one example of it. Now, this is William Butler Yeats. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1922, but basically, he didn't marry until the age of 51. And his mother thought he was mentally and physically handicapped. And then you have Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. He stuck to routines every day. He sticks to rituals every day. He loved rituals. And in fact, he related better to kids than to adults. Because with kids, he thought they were easier to understand. So he wrote Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. It became a smash hit. And finally, you have the Indian mathematician Ramanujan, who made many theories about divergent boundaries, everything about math that just really was very influential in mathematical history. But basically, he didn't talk to the age of 4, and he failed every subject except math, and everyone described him as in the clouds, or wishy-washy, or just didn't focus on everyone, but focused on himself. So basically, to summarize everything that I mentioned, autism is one huge question mark. You don't know how it's caused, we don't know how to treat it completely, we don't know how to cure it completely, we just don't know everything about it. But basically, my answer is to every single question about if autism can be cured or not, only time will tell. With genetic research and everything like that, there definitely will be advances 10 or 20 years from now, but right now, it's not really plausible to think of a true panacea for autism. And what do you think? This is a rhetorical question. Do you think any of these theories are better? Yes. Do you think any of these theories are better, and why? That's just a little food for thought for later. And that's my presentation.
Is a really good example of our biggest irritation and frustration on here. Guys who don't, in the middle, who don't do capstone might think that, oh my gosh, how can I work on something all year and take a whole year to do something? What they do is they run out of time. He could probably tell us another half an hour or an hour's worth of material if we had the time, and he could probably work on it for another year if he had the time. Thank you very much, Ben. It was a wonderful kickstart to our capstone presentation.